What's going on? Class is in attendance. So been getting a lot of comments lately, and probably just not lately, but in general, just, what my build is, what weapon should I use? Should it be Fixa Fatal, Fixa Termina, Fixa Attack, yada, yada, yada. And so I felt like, hey, it's a great time to showcase my build that isn't my skill tree. I have a video that I'll link in the top right corner for that skill tree video for Stia, but we're going to talk about gear, why I do certain things, and go from there. So overview, build, then we're going to review some damage factors. These are going to be important to understand when you are trying to make calculations and determine, hey, which weapon should I get? Which weapon's better than what? Should I get Fixa Fatal? Should I get Fixa Attack? Yada, 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 yada. Of course, understanding the Terminus system, understanding Augments quickly, and then we'll get into unit fixes, which really aren't that big of a deal in my opinion. Now, I do want to preface, this is from my opinion, so someone like myself is I guess you can call me a min-maxer. I'm going for full damage. While I value defense, I only value it to the degree that I do not die from a hit. So as long as I can survive a hit or most hits, that's as much defense as I need, and I'm going to go attack. This is not saying this is how you need to build or this is how you need to play the game. Just from my perspective, when you see the things you're gonna see, this is what we're getting into. So build, of course, right now I'm using Tenebris. Of course, this is from the JP server, so the name is gonna be in Japanese, but this is Tenebris, the ice weapon. As you'll see, I am essentially full potency, full variance. Now, of course, I use the word variance. Variance would be on the global server floor potency. I hate that term. It makes no sense. Variance is fine. So you're gonna hear me say variance, that means floor potency. Yada, yada, yada. Quick call out. Ability 4, that's also going to be different. That in the global server is going to be Mastery 4, but essentially the same thing. And I am using Fixa Fatal 5. We will get into why in a little bit, but essentially right now, crit is the meta, specifically crit rate. And so regardless of what weapon, generally Fixa Fatal is going to be the best Fixa at the moment. Now, of course, I'm going to show you some quick math. If you don't want to wait for a damage formula or can't figure it out and really want to know, hey, should I spend X amount of million on this weapon? This should give you a general idea. Now, should you today, January 23rd, should you spend $10 million on a Tenebris Fixa Fatal 5? I want to say no, just because we don't know what's going to happen when the update comes up on the 25th, but this would have been helpful for those who weren't sure to get this weapon when it was $3-4 million before everyone figured out, oh, this is kind of the weapon to get, because while Gunblaze in theory is a better weapon, because of its potential, it's not. I guess to keep things simple. So this is my main weapon. I have a similar weapon for the Effulgent series, the Flame Wand essentially, though I don't have ability 4 on it because it's a weapon that I don't use a lot. The same thing with Kuklofis. Of course, that's only Fixa Attack 3 because we can't get a Fatal, but generally speaking, when you're seeing my purple runs, this is the weapon that I use. My units, all 3 of them, exactly the same. Essentially the same augments as my Tenebris. The only difference is I do not have Ice Weaker because you can't right now get Ice Weaker. And so instead I have the Gigatech 4. I go for Fixa Guards. We'll get into a little bit with the units, but essentially I look at Fixa Guard as an offensive tool. Once again, remember, I am trying to figure out what is the minimum amount of defense or health or both that I need to survive one hit in a purple run so that I can take risks. So I can be faster when I'm trying to clear and not worried about dying and messing everything up. So that's why I opt for Fixa Guard. And then of course, this is just my stats, nothing crazy, but you're gonna see what my potency looks like given the fact that I am min-maxing variance and potency. And these are my add-on skills, but of course I think the only ones we really need to focus on is going to be Crit Power Up, which is level 19. You get that from the Fighter add-ons. Photon Blast Power Up, which you get from Ranger, which is level 17. Technique Weapon Power Up, which you get from Force, which is luckily level 20, and believe it or not, it only took me 2 level 1 rolls when add-ons first came out and I got a level 20. I don't ask questions and just, leave that alone. I guess damage resistance up is actually important. You get that on the Techter, your subskill add-ons, and crit rate up, which you get from your Braver, that being level 19. I wish I could get level 20 for crit rate up and crit power up, but hey, level 19 is better than anything else other than 20. So there's going to be some calculations in this video. We are always going to make the assumption that you have a crit power of level 20, meaning that you've got an additional crit power of 10%. In addition to, you have a crit rate of 10%. Though, of course, mine aren't that, they're 9.5, but when we go into calculations, that is the assumption that I am making. So if you're making your calculations, you want to kind of tweak that a little bit, even though it shouldn't matter for the most part, but that's something to keep in mind. So let's talk about some damage factors. First thing, crit rate. Base, we have 5% crit rate. So no matter what, we're always going to have a 5% chance to crit. With add-ons, as we just discussed, we get another 10% at add-on level 20. There are no augments right now that can boost crit. Depending on your weapon potential can boost crit. And if you get a Fixa fatal, that is 13% at level 5. Of course, crit rate being the rate in which you will land a critical attack. Next, crit damage, the amount of damage when landing a critical attack. This ignores variance. We have a base crit damage of 20%. But of course, if you have max add-ons, that's going to be 10% or 30%. Right now, there are no augments that boost crit damage. I think there are no weapon potential. I'm pretty sure there's no weapon potential. I might be missing that, but right now there is no weapon that's meaningful that boosts crit damage. And if you go for Fixa Termina level 5, you're going to get an additional 15%. So you're looking at 45%. Of course, this is heavily influenced by crit rate, and it ignores variance as we discussed before. I really want to influence that this is heavily influenced by crit rate because this is going to have some meaning when we start getting into which is better, like a Fixa Fatal or Fixa Termina. How do I make that distinction or determination? And then we have variance or floor potency, the amount of variance for any non-critical attack. Because once again, if you crit, you don't have to worry about variance, which is very important. The variance is based on your weapon. So if we're looking at Tenebrous, we're looking at a variance of 50 to 100. Add-ons, no. At least not right now. We'll see what happens in the future. Probably not, but who knows. Augments, yes. Weapon potentials, no. Fixa, no. And of course, potency, which is something that interacts with all of these technically. It really doesn't interact with crit rate. Crit rate just kind of is what it is. But potency is heavily influenced by variance. It determines the base value of the crit damage. So whatever damage you're doing, which is based on your potency and of course other interactions, whatever your crit damage is going to be 30 to 45% of that. And of course, no direct interaction with crit rate. Your crit rate is what it is, and then other things kick in. And of course, your potential is influenced by weapon potentials, augments, yada, yada, yada. Variance. Quickly, we need to understand variance. And now this is rough math. So if you're using the damage weapon formulas that are out there on the internet, they are definitely more accurate and more granular. But once again, these are tips for anyone who's like, should I be using this weapon? Or is this weapon better than this weapon? So on and so forth. Or should I be using this augment versus this augment? This is going to give you quick tips where you'll be able to make that distinction so that when others don't realize that this weapon is actually pretty good and they're selling it for 2 million versus 10 million, you get in on the ground floor, you save money, or you want to be a scumbag and start scalping the market. You do what you do. Those are your options. You have fun. So we're gonna look at Tenebrous again. And remember, it's got a variance from 50 to 100%. The easiest way to look at variance is to take 50 to 100%, add them together, and then divide by 2. And you'll look at your average damage at 75 or 75%. A distinction with average damage is this is on paper. Once again, variance is a roll. Every time you attack, the game is rolling the dice and determining, okay, based on this roll, are you going to land 100% of your attack damage? Or are you going to land 50%? Are you going to land somewhere in between? Average for simple terms is 75%. In any given run, will that be the case? Not necessarily. So that's why I say it's on paper, and runs will vary just because it is never guaranteed that things are going to be evenly distributed. It's just that based on chance and a way to look at numbers, this is something that we can generally accept. One of the important things, and we'll get into this in a little bit, when you're adding variance augments, you multiply the lower variance amount, so in this case 50, by the percentage of variance. You do not add variance to the lower end of, to the lower end of the 50, or your lower end of the variance. You multiply it. So Dreadkeeper, and we'll get to Dreadkeeper a little bit when we talk about augments, but Dreadkeeper gives you 6 floor potency or 6 variance. You are not going to add 6 to 50. You are going to multiply 50 by 6%, which comes out to what? I think it comes out to 3. So instead of it being 50, with one Dreadkeeper, your variance will be 53. As you can see, your average damage is not going to increase too much by variance. So for those who are running a whole bunch of Dreadkeeper 4s and you're trying to figure out why you're not doing a lot of damage, we'll get into those reasons. We saw a little bit of that because A, you're not adding potency. Variance is a multiplicative factor, so it's getting cut down in of itself. And so thus there is nothing to influence crit damage. There is nothing to influence damage overall. It's just, making your damage more stable. I wanted to call that out. This is how you handle variance. This is how you make that distinction. But I believe in a couple of days, Sega is actually going to give us visual indicators of what our variance is. So having to do this math is going to be much easier, but you still need to understand it when you're making your decisions, making your choices, making sure your calculations are on the mark. Let's look at fixes, specifically weapon fixes. So in this case, Fixa attack level 5 gives 5% potency. Once again, this is heavily influenced by variance. Then we have Fixa Fatal or Fixa Crit at level 5, it's 13%. What is its defining quality or feature? It is a game of chance. You roll the dice, maybe you crit, maybe you don't. And then Fixa Termina, which is crit damage. Once again, level 15% crit damage at level 5. This is also a game of chance, except it is controlled by crit rate. Crit rate is the one playing the game. Crit damage or Fixa Termina is just along for the ride. And this is important to understand when we start looking at the breakdown of these numbers and these calculations we're going to compute. So let's look at Tenebris with a Fixa attack 5. Tenebris base attack once again is 613, but of course you have Fixa 5. We're going to multiply that by 5%. How I'm doing this calculation, I am using base attack as a proxy for damage, which technically you shouldn't do, but for the sake of simplicity and sake of showing numbers, just imagine that your base attack is your damage, so that we're just gonna start multiplying variance and and crit damage and crit rate based on your base attack, thinking that, hey, that's gonna be your damage that you do. Average variance is 75%. We're not gonna worry about any augments, just to kind of show the differences between the 3 fixes. Our crit damage is gonna be 30%. We don't get any additional crit. This is just everything from the weapon's potential, your base crit, and your add-ons. Same thing with crit rate and crit damage. Crit rate damage equals 9%. Don't worry about that. I probably should have just deleted that. Sometimes what I do is I try to figure out how much potency on average do I get from your crit rate, but that's something that we don't need to worry about. So you can ignore crit rate damage. And really we want to focus on average base attack and crit damage. So average base attack is essentially your base attack when you're taking into account the average variance. So 75% of 644 gives you about 483. I will be doing some rounding just to make the numbers more visually appealing, and it shouldn't matter in the grand scheme. But when you crit, and once again, crit ignores variance, 837 damage. Now, what's important is the weighted average, because you have to remember your crit damage is only going to be at a crit rate of 30%. Of course, this is on paper. So you have to weight 30% of that 837 versus 70% of the time is going to be 483. That weighted average roughly comes out to about 589. So looking at Tenebris attack 5, we look at the weighted average, 589 damage on paper. Of course, that can fluctuate. And because the crit rate is lower, that fluctuation is going to hit this much more than, let's say, Fixa Fatal. So now, base attack is 313. Why? Because we don't have the 5% potency from attack. Variance is still going to be 75%. That's not going to change. Crit damage is not going to change, but crit rate will, because not only do we have the add-ons, the weapon potential, our base stat, but also the 13% from Fixa Fatal 5. Once again, we're going to ignore average crit rate damage. That's just something I do in my head that doesn't really matter. And so we're going to focus on average base attack, which is 460, crit damage, which is 797. So of course, if you just looked at these two numbers, you'd be like, oh, Fixa attack is stronger. But that weighted average is 605. And why is that? Because our crit damage of 797 will occur on paper 43% of the time, while the average damage will occur 57% of the time. This is different from Fixa Attack 5, where your average base attack will occur 70% of the time, and your crit damage will only occur 30%. So even though the stats across the board are weaker, because of that crit rate, it's at a certain level to where, on paper, this is going to be stronger. Now, Fixa Termina is just crit damage, and this is where things get interesting, but I'll explain why these two numbers look very, very similar and the things we have to think about. We don't have Fixa Attack 5, so we don't have the 5% increase, so our base attack is still 613. Average variance is still the same. Crit damage now, because now we have Fixa Fatal, is going to be 45% crit damage. Crit rate drops back down to 30% because we don't have Fixa Fatal. Ignore crit rate damage. Looking at average base attack, it should be the same as our Tenebrous Fatal 5, but our crit base attack should be 889. But of course, when we do its weighted average, that 460 on paper will occur 70% of the time versus that high crit attack, which will only occur 30%. And what do we see? We see that the weighted average is, in this example, and once again, this math is very high level, not granular, but is essentially equal to that of Fixa Attack 5. But at the end of the day, what we find is that Fixa Fatal or crit rate wins on paper overall. One of the things we have to think about is variance for both Attack 5 and Termina. And this is just very, don't take it too seriously, but just kind of like a rule of thumb. Potency is heavily influenced by variance. And so if you're getting bad rolls, your variance is going to cut into this harder than it will likely cut into this just because of the crit damage. So unless you just don't crit at all, which is fundamentally impossible, this is going to be able to resist variance more just because the crit damage that it does is 15% higher, and thus it ignores variance. And so the damage should, if you really did this, this math correctly, is going to edge on the side of Termina. And so effectively, you're going to look at Fixa Fatal 5 as your number 1 spot, Termina as your number 2 spot, and then Attack as your number 3. And generally right now, because this is the crit meta, this is how our 7-star, 8-star weapons are really going to fare. You can use this in the future to say, hey, what weapon should I use? What's better than this? What's better than that? Yada, 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 yada. Now, augments. This should be pretty obvious. Nil Soul 4, 3% potency. Highest potency right now, if we ignore Ice Weaker 2, because that can only happen on Tenebrous. What does this interact with? Well, this interacts with crit damage. This also interacts with variance, but really this is making our crit damage stronger. So with a higher crit rate, even our crit damage is not going to be as high as it could be with Fixa Termina, we're still pushing it as best as we can. Mastery 4 or Ability 4, same concept. 2.5% potency. This helps the crit damage. The variance helps when we aren't critting. Same thing with Al Secret 4. Potency helps the crit damage. Variance helps when we don't crit. The Oddies, once again, 3%, helps with the crit damage. Variance when we don't crit. Ice Weak 2, 4% potency, huge on the crit damage, and it gets beaten up by variance, but it is what it is. If you don't have Ice Weak 2, this is where you do Tech or Giga Tech 4. Same concept. Now we look at Dreadkeeper 4. We've talked about this, but this is why Dreadkeeper is a trap. 6% variance. It doesn't improve your damage like these do. Doesn't improve your crit damage. All it does is just it helps your normal non-crit damage be less rough when it comes to rolls. But as we saw early on, this is multiplicative. So you're not going to be adding this 6% to the lower end of your weapons variance. You're going to be multiplying that 6%, which means that you're not getting as much variance as you would like. And kind of like damage reduction, which we won't get into, but similar to damage reduction because damage reduction is multiplicative as well. You also get diminishing returns as you stack it, but at the end of the day, you're not improving your just normal damage. You're not improving your crit damage. So this is really putting you in a bad spot. And finally, unit fixes. For me, choose what you like. Why do I go fix a guard? And usually I don't go higher than level 3. Sure, just because it's very expensive if you get it off the player shop and the likelihood of it dropping is very rare. I go because I am trying to do maximum damage. That means I am trying to not only from an augment standpoint do maximum damage, but also from my damage rotations, my counters, and how I attack, I am trying to do the most damage possible. If you see in my latest runs, or my latest videos, I rarely use normal attacks. Why? Because for wand and mostly any weapon, normal attacks are weak, but they can be safe just because they're usually faster. I need to take risks. Risk is basically damage for me, but I also don't want to die from taking those risks because dying would mean no damage or losing time. I want to complete Stia Purple at some point in time. I need a faster time. So Fixa Guard allows me to take risks, which allows me to do more damage, more effective damage, and be faster while also covering for those situations where I take a hit. It doesn't ruin my time overall. And so as you've noticed in my runs, when I do take a hit, because of where my current damage reduction is and things of that nature, most things are not likely to kill me. When we get plus 60 for equipment, that's likely going to be the case more. If you said, hey, I want a more offensive oriented Fixa, which one's the best one to do? Your two choices are likely going to be Fixa Performa for that 4% PP consumption, or negative or minus 4% PP consumption, reducing how much PP you use, or Enthusia, attack PP recovery, just because this game is very counter heavy. And most counterattacks, I believe, I should be all counterattacks, give PP. So it's stacking on top of things you're naturally going to be doing. But really at the unit level, this is quality of life. There might be some weird builds where you don't have enough PP, or there might be something lacking to where a Performa or something might be beneficial. But I think all in all, especially if you're going for the higher tier fixes like you see on my unit and weapons, probably just a choice. And so hope that was helpful. Once again, I've got another video you can check in the top right corner, my skill tree, if you want to get a look at my whole build or different builds that I do for Techter Bouncer, Techter Fighter, Techter Force. Of course, questions and comments in the comment section are always obliged, and I will catch you all next time.